This is a high-level overview of the Zenforo architecture from the point that your web server has determined, probably through rewrite rules, which Zenforo script to fire. So in this particular case, we're going to start with index.php, which is used as the front controller for the public side of Zenforo. Index.php will then fire up the master XF class, which contains things like the data registry, so that it can work out which add-ons are loaded and pull up the various caches from the database in a single query, or bring them out from Memcache or Redis or whatever else we've got the cache stored in, to allow the execution to continue. After that, we'll bring up the app class, and the app is different depending on where you've come from. So as we've come from index.php, we're going to be using the public app. Then the app will start up the dispatcher, which is the first major component here. The dispatcher's job is to work out what to do with your request. So the first thing it needs to do is to hand off to the router, which will compare the URL that it's received with the list of routes that correspond to the particular area you're in. So in this case, the public area will use only the public routes, and it will compare your URL to its list of routes to try and get a match for a particular URL type to a particular controller and an action. And once it's worked out which one it should be using, it'll hand that back into the dispatcher, which will then fire off a request to the correct controller. Once we're in a controller, the first thing that will happen is the controller will run its pre-dispatch function. And the pre-dispatch function is essentially a function that handles jobs that need to be done regardless of which action is being called from that particular controller. So for example, in the user account system in Zenforo, the pre-dispatch controller function will make sure that only registered users can access it. Once the pre-dispatch is done, then the controller will fire up the particular action that was requested. Now, actions are where nearly all of the interesting stuff in Zenforo happens, as far as what happens that's different from one request to another. So there are a number of ancillary functions and facilities that are available to controller actions to make their job easier. So let's list a few of those. We have, for example, come back here. We have controller plugins. One example of a controller plugin would be the deletion plugin. So rather than having to duplicate the code to manage a dialog to say, are you sure you want to delete a particular thing, and then go through and actually do the deletion, you can just hand off to the controller plugin, which is an abstract collection of code to handle deletion of content. You could also have a service. And an example of a service is the poster service. So essentially, when someone posts a message, then rather than having a big block of code in the controller action, we pass off to the service, which handles the database insertion and all the watch notifications and alerts and all the other cache updates and the other stuff that happens in conjunction with a new post being made. Then we've also got repositories. And a repository is a data-specific collection of functions to assist you in working with a particular data item. So it might have the methods for updating caches for a particular item, or selecting a particular type of item. Those will all be found in repositories. And then to assist you in actually getting data from the database, we have the Finder system. The Finder is essentially a query builder that allows you to select data from the database, and it will return for you a collection of entities. Now, entities are Zenforo's data objects for interfacing with data in the database, and they have the ability to update and save themselves. They have the ability to operate on themselves, and they're just generally really clever methods of working with individual database items. Now, once your action has done all of its work using any number of those additional things, it will finish work and reply with a reply. It'll return a reply. And that reply will be of one particular kind. It could be an error or a message or a redirect or a view. So let's just look at one of those because it's the most interesting, most complicated. Let's have a look at a view. A view will have a number of components. It will have a name and a template name and some parameters. Those being the bits of data that we want to hand off to the next part of the code. So obviously if we've done some work on every user in the entire database, we're not going to want to return all of those users, but we will want to return some information that relates to what we've done. That's a terrible example, but hopefully you're following me. Now once that reply is formed, it will hand that back up to the dispatcher. And from there, the dispatcher will hand off to the renderer. Now the renderer will determine what the nature of the reply that it's received was. So as I said, it could be an error, in which case it will use its error handler. It could be a simple message, in which case it will probably reply with just that message together with any additional information about how that message should be displayed. It could be a redirect. Perhaps you've just finished editing some content and you just need to load up a new page. That will essentially short circuit the process and start the dispatcher again for the page that you're redirecting to. Or it could be a view. And if it's a view, then it will hand off to the view renderer. And the first job that the view renderer has to do is it looks to see if it has a class that corresponds to the name of the view that was passed back in the reply from the controller. And if it does have a corresponding class, then it will execute whatever code exists in that view class, and that will then hand back to the view renderer. And once that job is done, it will then start to return its data. So maybe you've requested some JSON data, in which case it will hand off the parameters that you've specified to the JSON renderer and spit that out. Or maybe it's XML, or most commonly HTML. And in the case of HTML, then we will start up the HTML renderer. Now the HTML renderer has a number of things that it can do, and just for example, it has the ability to take raw BB code and convert it back into HTML, ready for insertion into a template. And which that brings us on to the templater, which is arguably the most important part of the HTML renderer. The templater will take the parameters that you've returned from your view here and insert them into the template that you also named as part of your view. And that will create what we call the content template. The content template may also have instructions as part of Zenforo template syntax to wrap that template in a wrapper template. And then whether or not it has a wrapper or not, it will absolutely be enclosed within the page container template, which contains things like the metadata for the head tag and the general Zenforo interface Chrome. So once the templater has done its job and it's stuck your parameters into the appropriate template, it will hand that back to the HTML renderer, which will then send off the HTML page and the appropriate HTTP headers and that's essentially your request done. And so that is, in a nutshell, the Zen 4.0 architecture.